Your visual cortex is supposed to turn off when there is nothing to see. It doesn't. In total darkness, after the first hour, your visual cortex lights up more intensely than it does in daylight. And it is generating an entire world that your brain insists is real. The people who discovered this were using fMRI scanners to follow what happened inside the brain of someone who couldn't see, and they expected to find silence. What they found instead was something like the opposite of blindness. I came across this while working on something completely unrelated, a problem about how the brain processes time in cave systems. I'd been reading about the earliest cave explorers, people who went down into places where the sun had never touched, and I noticed something odd in the historical records. The explorers kept describing the same sensation, a kind of interior noise, a feeling of being crowded inside their own skulls. I thought at first this was just the psychological weight of the darkness itself, the way fear makes you feel claustrophobic. But then I found the research on sensory deprivation, and I realized I'd been thinking about this exactly backwards. The noise wasn't coming from the absence of stimulation. The noise was what your brain does when it's finally, for the first time in your waking life, running without input. I spent 3 weeks assuming the mechanism was simple. Less light in, less activity in the visual cortex, more darkness, quieter brain. That's not even close to right, and the reason it's not close to right is actually more interesting than the simple version would have been. What actually happens is that your brain doesn't reduce its activity in the absence of stimuli. It redirects it. It starts talking to itself. Here's what I want to take you through. First, what we know about how your eyes and brain are supposed to work together in normal conditions. Not wrong, but incomplete. Second, what the research actually shows happens when that partnership gets cut off. And third, the part that almost nobody discusses, which is what that mechanism tells us about consciousness itself, which is something that has resisted simple answers for a surprisingly long time. At any given moment, your brain is receiving a torrent of sensory information. Visual data alone, just what your eyes are sending up the optic nerve, comprises roughly 30% of your cortex. That's not a metaphor. That's 30% of your brain's processing power dedicated to one sense. Your other senses share the remaining 70%. Vision dominates. It has to, because for a creature like you, sight is survival. Your ancestors could spot movement on the horizon. They could read the precise color shift of fruit to know if it was ripe. They could see the predator before the predator saw them. But here's what makes this relevant. Your brain is not a passive receiver of that visual information. It's actively predicting what it's about to see. Before your eyes send the signal up the optic nerve, your brain has already generated a hypothesis about what's out there. The visual cortex isn't waiting for data. It's constantly generating a model of the world, and then it's checking that model against the incoming sensory stream. When the prediction matches the incoming data, everything feels normal. When there's a mismatch, that's when you notice something. That's when you see something unexpected, or something moving, or something wrong. This is called predictive processing, and it's one of the most important concepts neuroscience has uncovered in the last 30 years. The brain is not a camera recording reality. It's a prediction machine constantly betting on what comes next. And the input from your eyes is just the correction mechanism, the way the brain knows whether its prediction was right or wrong. Now, imagine what happens when that correction mechanism disappears. Imagine you're in a place where no photons are reaching your eyes. Not low light, not dim light, complete absence, total darkness. The kind of darkness that exists only in caves or in soundproofed laboratory cells or in the void between stars. Your visual cortex doesn't receive any input. There are no photons to process. There's no signal coming up the optic nerve. So what does the prediction machine do? It doesn't shut down. It does something else entirely. In 1951, a psychologist named Donald Hebb set up an experiment that would become the foundation for everything we understand about sensory deprivation. This grew out of a clandestine Cold War project. The CIA was convinced American prisoners of war had been brainwashed, and they wanted to understand how. Hebb wasn't particularly interested in brainwashing. He was interested in a question that had haunted him for years. He'd read reports of Royal Air Force pilots who, after many hours of flying in isolation and staring at an unchanging skyline, would suddenly lose control of their planes and crash. He'd read about Inuit hunters who warned against fishing solo because without visual cues in a whiteout Arctic landscape, they would become disoriented and paddle out to sea. He wondered what happened in the brain when stimulation was stripped away entirely. He built 4 by 6 by 8 foot cells, air-conditioned, soundproofed. He recruited university students, paid them $20 a day, which was serious money in 1951, and asked them to stay in the cells for as long as they could tolerate it. The volunteers wore frosted plastic goggles that blocked pattern vision, cotton gloves, cardboard cuffs from elbow to fingertip to reduce touch, a foam pillow over their ears, sensory isolation in its purest form. Hebb expected the subjects might get bored. He joked that the worst part would be the postdocs cooking. When the results came in, he was stunned. The disorientation was far more extreme than he'd anticipated. One volunteer, upon finishing the study, drove out of the laboratory parking lot and crashed his car. Subjects got lost in the bathroom and had to be guided back to the cells by researchers. But most striking were the hallucinations. After just a few hours in isolation, nearly all the subjects saw things that weren't there. Not vague impressions, vivid, elaborate, integrated scenes. One subject reported seeing a parade of squirrels marching across a snowy field, each wearing snowshoes and a backpack. Another saw a bathtub being steered through space by an old man in a metal helmet. In an extreme case, a subject encountered a second version of himself in the room, and the two versions began to blend together until he couldn't discern which was which. As Hebb wrote later, it is one thing to hear that the Chinese are brainwashing their prisoners on the other side of the world. It is another to find in your own laboratory that merely taking away the usual sights, sounds, and bodily contacts from a healthy university student for a few days can shake him right down to the base. For decades, those hallucinations remained mysterious. Researchers knew they happened. They didn't know why. Then in 2007, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research in Frankfurt collaborated with a German artist named Marietta Schwartz. Schwartz had decided to volunteer for something extraordinary. She would live blindfolded for 22 days in a laboratory while researchers tracked her brain activity using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, which monitors blood flow to different regions of the brain in real time. She recorded a continuous diary into a dictaphone documenting everything happening in her subjective experience. The researchers, meanwhile, were watching her visual cortex. And this is where it gets strange. Not for researchers who have lived with this for years, but for you specifically, because of what you already know from 2 minutes ago, that your visual cortex is supposed to turn off without input. Schwartz reported the hallucinations Hebb's subjects had reported 50 years earlier. Intricate abstract patterns, bright amoebas, yellow clouds, animal prints, geometric shapes that dissolved and reformed, faces that appeared and vanished, all of it vivid, all of it real to the part of her brain generating it. And on the fMRI scans, her visual cortex was on fire. Despite the complete, total absence of visual input, no light, no photons, nothing entering through her eyes, her visual cortex lit up as intensely as it does in normal daylight. It was generating a complete visual world. The hallucinations she reported, the amoebas, the patterns, the shapes, those weren't imaginary in the way you might think. They were real neural activity. They were literally what her visual cortex was producing. What the fMRI revealed was something the prediction machine model had predicted, but nobody had actually seen in action. When the incoming sensory data disappears, the prediction machine doesn't shut down. It keeps running. It keeps generating predictions about what should be out there. And with no incoming correction signal, no data to check those predictions against, the brain simply accepts its own predictions as reality. Your visual cortex generates a hypothesis about what's out there. Under normal conditions, your eyes check that hypothesis against what's actually happening. The match or mismatch tells your brain whether it got it right. But in total darkness, there's no check. There's no incoming data, so the hypothesis doesn't get corrected. It elaborates, it expands, it becomes increasingly elaborate and increasingly real. You might be thinking that this only applies in laboratory conditions, in these extreme cases of complete sensory deprivation, and if so, you're right to think that, but it doesn't rescue the original assumption in the way you might hope, because the mechanism itself doesn't care about laboratory conditions. The mechanism is just how your brain works. Strip away the sensory input and the prediction machine keeps running. It's not a malfunction. It's the default state of a brain that has learned over evolution to interpret its own activity as the world. This is where most explanations stop. They tell you what happens and leave it there. Hallucinations occur because the brain generates its own stimuli. Fine. But that framing misses something crucial, something that changes how you think about consciousness itself. Here's what I didn't expect to find. The hallucinations aren't random noise. They're not the brain malfunctioning. They're the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, but without the usual constraint. Your brain is always generating a model of the world, always making predictions, always running a simulation of what's out there. Under normal conditions, sensory input keeps that simulation tethered to reality. Reality is the anchor, but remove the anchor and the simulation doesn't collapse. It elaborates. It becomes more detailed, more coherent, more integrated. A researcher I came across described it this way. The brain is not a passive receiver. It's an active generator of experience. 90% of what you see right now, this moment, your experience of reading these words, is not coming from your eyes. It's coming from your brain's prediction about what should be there. Your eyes are just correcting the errors in that prediction. They're just the editing function. Remove the input and you realize something unsettling. The world you're experiencing right now is 90% generated by your own brain. The eyes are almost secondary. This is not metaphorical. This is how vision actually works. When you stare into darkness long enough, your brain stops trying to match its predictions to reality because there is no reality to match them to. And so it generates whatever its prediction system creates. Sometimes those are memories. Sometimes they're combinations of memories. Sometimes they're novel scenes your brain constructs entirely. But they all have the same quality. They're what your brain does when it's no longer constrained by external reality. The thing that makes this even stranger, and this is where I had to correct my own thinking about what was happening, the hallucinations don't feel like hallucinations to the person experiencing them. They feel like perception. They feel like sight. Schwartz, blindfolded in the laboratory, reported that the amoebas and patterns and shapes felt as real as anything she could touch. Her brain was not labeling them as false or internal or generated by me. Her brain was labeling them as out there, as sight, because from the perspective of her visual cortex, they were sight. They were visual information being processed as visual information. This matters because it reveals something about how your brain decides what counts as reality. It doesn't have an objective reality detector. It has a coherence detector. If the signal is coherent, if it's integrated with the rest of your sensory experience, if it's sustained and structured, your brain treats it as real. The source doesn't matter. The source is almost irrelevant. Marietta Schwartz was lying blindfolded in a laboratory with no visual input, and yet she was experiencing sight. She was experiencing it as vividly as you experience the room around you right now. That sight was generated entirely by her own brain, with no input from her eyes whatsoever. And her brain, the same brain that's reading the words on the screen for you right now, insisted it was real. Here's where this connects to something deeper, something that almost nobody discusses when they talk about sensory deprivation. The hallucinations don't end when sensory input returns. The structure of how you think about consciousness, how you think about where your experience comes from, it changes permanently. People who spend extended time in sensory deprivation, in total darkness, often report a lasting shift in how they perceive reality. The boundary between internal and external becomes less certain. They become more aware of how much of their experience is generated rather than received. Some describe it as disorienting. Some describe it as liberating. All describe it as a fundamental shift in how they understand their own mind. There's a question that neuroscientists have been circling for a long time. What counts as consciousness? What makes an experience real? And the standard answer, that consciousness is the reception of external stimuli, becomes obviously incomplete once you understand what actually happens. In sensory deprivation, your brain can generate a complete, coherent, vivid experience with zero external input. So where does consciousness live? Is it the input? Is it the generation? Is it the coherence itself? I don't think neuroscience has a good answer to that yet. What it has is evidence that consciousness is more about how your brain generates and integrates information than about what information it's receiving. The experience Schwartz had, seeing the amoebas, the patterns, the shapes, that was consciousness. It was subjective experience. It was qualia, to use the technical term. It was what it is like to see something. And it was happening entirely inside her own brain with no external referent at all. This is the part that sits wrong if you think about it too long. You are walking around right now believing that you're perceiving an external world. And you're perceiving it, but you're perceiving a model of it, a simulation of it, one that your brain generated on the basis of a tiny fraction of actual sensory input. Your eyes send up information. Your brain uses that information to correct its prediction. But the prediction, the simulation, that's what you're experiencing. That's your consciousness. Strip away the input, and the simulation keeps running. It keeps generating, it generates a world that feels completely real, because from the inside, there is no difference between a perception that matches external reality and one that doesn't. They're both just patterns of neural activity. They're both processed the same way. They both feel like seeing. The early explorers in caves, the ones who reported feeling crowded inside their own skulls, feeling like their brain was making noise. They were experiencing this. They were in a place where their sensory input was so minimal that their brain's prediction system began to generate its own stimuli. Not hallucinations in the clinical sense necessarily, but the sensation of internal activity becoming more salient than external input. The feeling of consciousness turned inward. Donald Hebb's subjects trapped in those soundproofed cells experienced it more acutely. The squirrels in snowshoes, the bathtub steering itself through space, the duplicate self. These weren't random noise. These were the products of a brain that had been released from the constraint of matching its predictions to external reality. And so it elaborated, it created, it hallucinated, which really just means it continued doing what it always does, but without correction. Marietta Schwartz, blindfolded for 22 days, experienced it with the most scientific precision, and the fMRI scans proved it. Her visual cortex was generating the entire world she was seeing. Her brain was conscious of that world. She was conscious of it, and none of it was coming from outside her own skull. This is what I think about now when I think about consciousness. Not as something that happens to you when you receive external stimulation, but as something your brain does, a process it engages in, whether the input is coming from the world or from itself. Consciousness is not about the source of the information. It's about the integration of the information. It's about the coherence of the model. It's about whether your brain can sustain a structured, persistent, internally consistent pattern of activity. And that pattern can be generated by your own neural tissue with no external input at all. The darkness you might experience if you ever spent hours in a cave or in a sensory deprivation tank, or in any place where external stimulation was stripped away, that darkness wouldn't be empty. It would be full of what your own brain generates when it's no longer constrained by external reality. Full of the kind of consciousness you always produce, but without the correction signal that usually tells you whether it matches what's actually out there. You might see patterns, geometric shapes, colors. You might see faces or figures or scenes. You might see things that make sense and things that make no sense at all. Some people report profound peace in that darkness. Some report profound terror. The specific content depends on what your brain generates, what your memory contains, what your prediction system constructs in the absence of correction. But all of it would be real in the sense that matters. All of it would be consciousness. All of it would be experience. And all of it would be coming from inside your own skull. Here's what bothers me about this, and I suspect it might bother you too. The boundary you think exists between perception and imagination, between the world and your experience of the world, that boundary is less stable than you believed. Under normal circumstances, with sensory input constantly correcting your brain's predictions, the boundary feels solid. The world feels like it's out there and your experience of it is in here, but that's because the prediction and the perception are synchronized. They're aligned. But they don't have to be aligned. Your brain can generate a complete, coherent, vivid world with zero external input. Has done it, does it every time you dream. Can do it indefinitely if you remove the sensory correction signal entirely. So the question becomes, what makes a perception real? Is it the external source? Is it the accuracy? Is it the conviction with which your brain insists it's real? Because Schwartz's amoebas were just as real neurologically as anything you're seeing right now. They were processed the same way. They felt the same way. The only difference was the source. And the source, the origin of the signal, that might matter to your sense of how the world works. But it doesn't matter to your brain. To your brain, a signal is a signal. I think that's the thought that doesn't shake loose the realization that you're not as tethered to external reality as you believed. That you're generating far more of your experience than you suspected. That consciousness is less about receiving the world and more about your brain's ability to generate a coherent model, whether that model matches reality or not. In darkness, without the correction signal, your brain demonstrates what it can do on its own. It demonstrates what consciousness really is. Not perception, but generation. Not reception, but construction. Not a passive window onto the world, but an active production of experience. And when you turn the lights back on, when you step out of the darkness and external sensory input floods back in, you might find that the boundary between internal and external isn't as clear as it was before. You might become more aware of how much of what you thought was perceiving is actually generating. You might notice the simulation more often. That awareness is disorienting. But it might also be the closest thing neuroscience has found to an honest answer about what consciousness is, for now.